Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and the guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about my three-pronged solution to gun violence in the United States. And it begins, oddly enough, with enforcing the laws that we already have. But you probably already knew that we had laws. In fact, most states have laws that prevent a felon from ever owning a gun. And, of course, the Federal Gun Control Act also prevents a felon from owning a gun. It also prevents a domestic abuser from owning a gun. It prevents somebody who has been convicted of a misdemeanor where they could spend more than 1 year in jail from owning a gun. There are lots of different laws on the books that restrict who can own guns, and most of them are constitutional in that they prohibit people who have a track record of not obeying the law in the first place. Hence, they are usually criminals. Although psychotic people can also be looped into that, and I do think there are probably some really crazy people out there who manage to get past that. The fact is, for the most part, gun laws are already on the books that would stop a majority of gun crime from happening if they were just enforced. But the fact is, most felons do not get their guns from the local gun store. They get their guns from other felons who steal them from law-abiding citizens. And here we have the law-abiding citizen more or less becoming a unindicted co-conspirator with the bad guys by virtue of not locking up firearms. This is especially true in vehicles. People will leave a firearm in a vehicle, and then when somebody breaks the glass and takes the gun, they report the gun as stolen, but by that point, now a felon has possession of your firearm and will no doubt use it against someone else. It is a terrible thing to have your firearm stolen just because it's a violation of your personal property interests, but it's also a terrible thing because it arms a bad person who shouldn't have a gun. As a result, step one is to require guns to be locked in cars. And if they are not, fine people. If a patrol officer walks by a car and sees a firearm lying in a car, he should immediately write a ticket, find out who is operating the vehicle, write a ticket, and tack it on the car. And that's because if he can see the firearm, one of the bad guys can see it and quite likely make off with it. A lot of times people don't even lock the door to their car. If you leave your gun in your vehicle, put it in a gun safe. They make lots of gun safes that you can use to lock your gun in your car so it can't be stolen, or at least so that it will be very difficult to be stolen. Similarly, in your house, if you don't have your firearms in a gun safe, they need to be in a gun safe. And again, if you can afford firearms, you can afford a gun safe. Now, you may think, well, nobody wants to get up and dial a gun safe when somebody's breaking in the back door. And for that, I have a solution. And this is what it is. It is a fast action gun safe. Notice how it works. There is this little port right here, which is a fingerprint port. And if I touch my finger to that fingerprint port, boom, the safe automatically comes open, just like that. That safe is less than $50 on Amazon. And there's no reason not to have it. It works really well, operates on 4 AAA batteries. If it should be locked and your batteries fail, you can plug it in to a USB-C converter, one of the little things you use to charge an iPhone or an Android phone with, and it will open right back up if you put in the right combination or the right fingerprint. So there are ways to fail-safe a device like that. I would suggest that, for the most part, having a gun safe at the bedside table is good. Having a fingerprint gun safe is especially good. You can get to the weapon quickly if somebody does start kicking in your back door, or your front door either, for that matter. So, Tier 1, lock up guns when not in use. That's what every responsible gun owner should do. The second tier of the process is prosecutors. Prosecutors need to do their job. Far too often in the criminal justice system, when gun charges exist, they are the first things bargained away. And they shouldn't be bargained away. They should be prosecuted. When someone uses a firearm in the commission of a felony, even if they don't point it at anybody, even if it never leaves their holster or their pants, it should be prosecuted as a gun crime, and they should do the full time for it. The federal law prohibits using a gun in a crime, and it can be prosecuted federally. And most states have similar laws. And the third tier in this tripod of gun violence reduction is judges. Judges have to do their job. They can't buy into every sad sob story that somebody comes up with as to why they shouldn't go to jail. I understand there are people whose mothers abandoned them, whose fathers abandoned them, whose aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, grandparents abandoned them. I understand there are people who fell into drugs and did other bad things, and now their life is a wreck, but you know what? That's on them. I understand they're in a bad way, but they need to go to jail, especially if they're an addict. If they go to jail, hopefully there won't be any drugs in the jail, and to the extent that there are, they're going to be very difficult to get. It would aid a great deal in breaking these addictions, and that, I think, is an excellent thing to do. Those three things will do a lot more for stopping gun violence than will passing new laws. And you may be wondering why I feel so strongly about this. Well, I have a couple of stories to tell you with respect to why there should be a great deal more emphasis on prosecuting criminals. So let me introduce you to the late Justin Flores. In 2011, Mr. Flores, out in California, was arrested, charged, and convicted of first-degree burglary, a felony, and car theft, also a felony. He was sentenced to 3 years in the state prison, but apparently this effort at rehabilitating him didn't do a lot of good. Because in 2020, he was arrested yet again for felon in possession of a firearm. In addition, he was arrested for possession of methamphetamine. So police found him carrying a gun and taking drugs, or at least having drugs. One assumes that if one has drugs in their possession, they also have them to be used. So they arrested him and charged him with both of these counts. Now, when Mr. Flores goes in front of the judge, the prosecutor revokes the first strike from the prior burglary conviction. He basically takes it off the table and says, we're not going to talk about that. He does that because otherwise Flores would have been sentenced to 3 years in state prison again for being a felon in possession and in possession of drugs. But that was not to be. Mr. Flores served a total of 20 days in the county jail, and then they let him go. He was not prosecuted federally for having this felon in possession charge. He wasn't referred to the U.S. attorney to bring federal gun charges, which could have happened. No. Then, in June of 2022, his wife calls police because this man is beating her and he's holding her prisoner in a motel room. 2 police officers respond to that call. And here are the 2 officers. On the left, you have Officer Santana, was roundly recognized as a terrific police officer, had always wanted to be a police officer. He had family members who served in law enforcement, and that was his dream. He became a San Bernardino County deputy, and then, when it became possible, he became an El Monte, California police officer. Now, the gentleman over here on the right, that's Officer Paredes. He was his training officer on the day of this incident. Both of these individuals knew that they needed to get that woman out of the hotel room or motel room in order to save her life. When they busted into the room to pull her out, Mr. Flores ducked back into the bathroom. And he wasn't trying to escape. He grabbed his firearm from inside the motel bathroom and shot Officer Santana in the head and Officer Paredes in the head. Both officers were killed. If the DA had done his job in 2020 on the felon in possession charge, Flores would not have been out of jail on this date. He would not have been able to immediately obtain another firearm. He would not have been beating and abusing his wife. Instead, he would have been locked up with the rest of the felons in the California prison system. Los Angeles had a criminal justice reform district attorney, and his job was supposed to be prosecuting criminals, but he set policies that essentially allowed the inmates to run the asylum. And as a result, people who should have been prosecuted and sent to jail for long periods of time were instead allowed to go free with 20 days served in the county jail. That ought to alarm everyone. But that's not all. This upstanding young man is the name of Hassan Elliott. And on June 8th of 2017, in Philadelphia, he was arrested for threatening a neighbor with a gun. He was arrested and taken to jail and apparently could not make bail. This was under the prior DA. In January of 2018, after the new DA took over, he entered a negotiated plea for 9 to 23 months in jail. Then on the very next day, January 25th, he is paroled after having spent 7 months and 16 days in jail. So they put him on a form of high-risk probation/parole monitoring. And almost immediately, he violated his parole. He tested positive for multiple drugs, and then he just stopped showing up at the parole officer's location. And over time, it took a little while. This is January of 2018. We go for a full year, and then the court schedules a parole revocation hearing for February 6th of 2019. But he never made it to that parole revocation hearing. Why? Because on January 29th, he was arrested after a foot pursuit and charged with 15 packets of cocaine he had in his pocket. Even though he had a probation violation hearing or a parole violation hearing set for February 6th, the district attorney's office allowed him to be released on his own recognizance with no bail. Flash forward to March 13th, 2020, where Mr. Elliott is living in a stash house along with a number of other gang members when a SWAT team kicks in the door and raids the house. They immediately launch up the stairs to where they believe Elliott is, and as they're kicking in the door, he comes out with a semi-automatic firearm and shoots Sergeant James O'Connor 16 times, killing him. And he would not have been available to do that if it hadn't been for the fact that he was released on his own recognizance just a few months earlier. Let's take a look at the statistics for gun crimes in Philadelphia. There were 1,810 gun crime cases. Of them, 1,114 were dismissed or withdrawn, 62%. 151 went to trial with 47 convictions, roughly 3% of the total, and about a 33% conviction rate. 545 pleaded guilty, that's 30%, and the prior DA's conviction rate was 73%. The current DA's conviction rate is 35%. Then we have violations of Pennsylvania's Uniform Firearms Act. 73 charges were dropped, 32%. 45 pleaded guilty, that's 19%. Of those 45, 40 of those went to county jail. So 76% of these offenders were back on the street within 16 months. But it's not just Philly. 33% of all felonies in St. Louis were dismissed last year before last. 617 violent crimes, or roughly 19 for every 1,000 residents. Almost 20 for every 1,000 residents. Your chance of being a victim in St. Louis was 1 in 50. The rest of the state, it was 1 in 184. And in spite of that, the DA at the time, Ms. Gardner, refused to prosecute many of the cases that were brought to her. But it's not just LA and Philly and St. Louis, it's also Chicago. Over the course of 3 years, there were 8,426 incidents of gun violence. Only 334 of those got federal gun-related prosecutions. 4 of those prosecutions for every 100 incidents is the average, 4%. In St. Louis, it's 46%, and in Detroit, it's 68%. This is really fairly unbelievable when you get right down to it. And this doesn't even scratch the surface of what happens with violations of the National Instant Background Check System. Then we get into the NICS checks. Of the NICS checks, in a 2016 audit, that's the National Instant Background Check System for purchasing a firearm, only 45% of the cases referred by the ATF were ever prosecuted. Now, they would be prosecuted for lying on the 4473 form, which says you have to tell truthfully whether or not you've been convicted of a crime or anything like that. So you'd be prosecuted for perjury or for attempting to make a gun purchase when you were not allowed to. Only 45% were prosecuted, 54% were never charged, and they say that's because the Department of Justice was prioritizing substantial federal interests. Well, it seems to me that the reduction of crime, and particularly gun crime, would be a significant federal interest. Do you see the problem here? We are not prosecuting people who try to buy guns and are not allowed. When people become felons and possess a firearm, we're dismissing those charges so that we can get an easy conviction on something else like drug possession. Even when there are serious issues, for example, burglary, methamphetamine possession, all of that could send somebody to jail for a long time, we look the other way and we let them out after 20 days or after 7 months. Or we just don't prosecute 1/3 of the felonies to begin with. I mentioned this in the other video, but hanging Judge Parker had it absolutely right. It is not the severity of punishment that prevents crime. It is the certainty of punishment that prevents crime. If a person knows that if they take a gun into the bank and show it to the clerk and rob that bank, not only are they going to get the 10 years for the bank robbery, they are also going to get 10 years for using a firearm in the commission of a felony. Now, that's what should happen. But a lot of times, the felon in possession charge is just dismissed, or the use of a gun in a felony is dismissed, or it's never filed because the person is prosecuted in state court and there's no crosstalk between the DA's office at the state level and the U.S. Attorney's office at the federal level. If you want to stop gun crime, and I hope the governor of New Mexico is listening, if you want to stop gun crime, everyone who is arrested for illegal possession of a firearm, felon in possession especially, should immediately be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And if the U.S. Attorney's Office says it doesn't have the resources to do that, then you should apply such political pressure as is necessary to get them to do that. The same thing should happen at the state level. If someone uses a firearm in a crime, they should be prosecuted and the gun charge should be tacked on in addition. And then the third sort of peg on this tripod to stop gun violence is you have to have judges who are willing to do their job. Now, judges hear every sad sob story known to man. So the judge gives them probation or allows them to serve a short sentence in the county jail and sends them packing. And then the judge sees them again 6 weeks later, and they're again standing in front of him, and this time, he knows for sure that they didn't turn their life around. Does he send them to jail? Sometimes the answer to that is no. And that is what's frustrating to people like Grady Judd, who is the Florida sheriff who is very strong on this topic. That's what's frustrating to people who believe that law and order is an important function of government. It's an important function of both federal and state government. The law should be equally applied, it should be universally applied, and there should never be a situation where these offenses become bargaining chips to be used to essentially get out of jail free. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. Now, obviously, you have a role in this. As a citizen, you can go to your state legislature and say, I want this fixed. I want these issues taken care of. I want to see criminals prosecuted. And yes, I understand I might have to pay more in taxes for you to build bigger prisons, but I'm willing to put more people in prison in the short term to get the message across. Because I can assure you that, at least with respect to most felons, particularly most career criminals, if they knew they were going to do a hard 10 or a hard 20 years, and again, if you get sentenced in the federal system to 10 years, you do 10 years. There's no time off for good behavior. You're sentenced, you do the full term. And if they knew they were going to do the full term for a gun crime, more likely than not, they wouldn't do the gun crime. Now, as to young people, gangbangers running around living the thug life, okay, maybe there is no way to deter them from doing this, but if you lock up enough of them, they just have to kill one another in the jails instead of on the streets. So that's what I have for you today. I do think that there is a way to stop gun violence, but in order to do that, we have to enforce the law. And it has to be by the police agencies at the get-go, by the prosecutors at the next level, and then by the judges. And if you do that, you can stop gun crime. But not if every sad sob story convinces a judge to let somebody go. I'm sorry, but if you do the crime, like the old TV show Beretta said, if you do the crime, you better be prepared to do the time. That's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have the opportunity today, go out and do something nice for somebody. And have a great day. I'll catch you down here next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.